Okay, we are now live. Welcome, everybody. I am your right geek, honorary man king, and leader of the Awkward Cough Squad, here with number one Marmaduke fan and Punchy Sonichu. We are going to talk today about The Giver, the 1993 book by Lois Lowry. And I just want to warn up front, summa spoilerum, summa tangentum, and summa triggerum for this discussion. We're just going to keep it pretty casual, but we're going to talk about what we think about The Giver and its potential relevance for things that are going on today. Number one Marmaduke fan, how are you today?
I'm doing all right. The funny story about this one for me is my mom was going to read The Giver, and she got the graphic novel by accident and just gave that to me because she figured number one Marmaduke fan, I call her. She just figures, hey, you'll like this. So I actually haven't read the original novel, but I have read the graphic novel, and it seems like it was P. Craig Russell, and he's very concerned about doing faithful adaptations. I guess I'm going to be providing a Bart Simpson book report today on the overall story.
Actually, I just read the graphic novel this week, and I have read the original novel as well. And the graphic novel is basically 99% faithful. So it's good. What you know is definitely much more than a Bart Simpson report for sure. And
Punchy Sonichu was a Chad and actually read the book just in time.
I'm actually feeling a bit embarrassed now. I think I overdid it because Marmaduke mentioned yesterday actually that you guys were going to do The Giver, and I was like, oh shoot, I don't know if I've read it. I'm vaguely aware of the book, but if I did read it, it was like back in grade school. So I went and found a copy and belted it out in one afternoon. So I'm fresh having read it, not even 24 hours ago. So it was the original book. I actually didn't know about the graphic novel. I would have read the graphic novel had I known there was a good one. But yeah, so I guess I can opine on the original book, and Mom can do the graphic novel, and we can both get insight from you on the entire multiverse, cinematic universe, whatever it is for The Giver.
Yeah, because I'm the super Chad who read the original book. I read the graphic novel this week, and I actually went and saw the movie when they did a movie adaptation. I don't even remember what year they did that, but it was fairly recently, you know.
Oh, okay.
So that may be why.
I guess there is a cinematic universe.
There is a cinematic universe, yeah, sort of.
Okay.
The movie is much less faithful, although it's faithful to the theme of the book at least, but it does change a lot of things around. All right, so what are some of the first things that struck you about The Giver, since you guys both read it kind of for the first time fairly recently? What was it that really struck you about the story that is told?
One thing that stood out to me is every dystopia, I think you kind of have to borrow from, Aldous Huxley and George Orwell. They sort of established the rules of the genre for everybody else, I think. And it was striking to me that The Giver seems to be talking about the same theme of how a dystopia would work, but it's the world building is very different from either Brave New World or Oceania. The Giver's world, it has a lot. It's sort of like, instead of language means nothing in Newspeak, in the Giver's world, language is purely precise and very logical and cold, but it doesn't have any emotional weight to it. There's also maybe an interesting element where the Giver has a magical element that we don't quite understand. We don't quite get how the Giver passes on these memories to people. We just kind of have to accept that that's one of the ways that things work, without having like every little detail of, is it magic? Is it scientific? Blah, balderdash affecting this, but it's a useful premise for setting up this idea of memory being something that can be passed from person to person and affecting the world and the politics.
And it seems to have a suggestion of being almost genetic in a way, because one thing that's mentioned in the book is the fact that Jonas has unusual eyes, that he has unusually pale eyes. And Gabriel, the baby, also has those same eyes, and Jonas is able to pass on his memory of sales to Gabriel. So it seems like there's some sort of possible, they're mutants. They're mutants. That's what they are. They're like telepathic mutants that can pass their memories on. I don't know, but yeah, you're right that the author didn't really bother to explain that, and I'm not sure it necessarily needs an explanation in order for the story to move forward. Punchy, what about you?
All right. Well, there's actually quite a lot that I could say about this, because again, I'm just fresh off of reading it and got so many things going on in my mind. Just real quick though, I think Marmaduke hit a lot of the really good themes. It definitely not a Bart Simpson book report. I mean, you know, I was expecting like, you know, it's about an old man and he's colorless. And did I mention he stares at you? In conclusion, right? But yeah, I think either Marmaduke is incredibly intelligent, or the graphic novel was incredibly similar to the book, or probably both, I would imagine. Yes. But yeah, that's kind of what I was getting out of the book as well. There are some things that I might a little bit disagree with Marmaduke on. For example, he'd mentioned that the book was cliffing off of Huxley and Orwell, and like that may be true. From what I understand, this was written in the 90s, correct? 1993, I think.
1993, yeah.
Yeah, so in that sense, like, I mean, anybody writing in the 90s is going to be aware of Brave New World in 1984. But I don't think that they originated the idea of the utopian novel. And I think one of the things that I found very interesting about The Giver was the ways that it was connecting to sort of pre-1984 utopian writings in a way that, you know, 1984 and Brave New World didn't necessarily go, right? It was finding its own path through these late 19th century, early 20th century ideas of how we might construct a utopian society, and then, you know, how that might go horribly wrong, because you know, that's how it would go if we're trying to construct a utopian society. Also, the eyes thing, I was actually going to bring that up as evidence of white supremacy in the book, because I know this book was frequently challenged. It's one of the most banned books, I guess. Have you heard of that?
I'm not
sure. Yeah, it's. I know it has been challenged quite a lot. I'm not sure what exactly was challenged about it. What people found objectionable, and I actually used to work in a bookstore fresh out of high school, so I've got maybe a cynical take on banned books. I think to a degree, banned books is like a marketing strategy that people will overstate the amount of controversy that a book gets in order to generate more sales and get people talking about them. So I'm not sure to what degree this book was actually being banned, or on what grounds it was being banned. But I was noticing a lot of things that would get it released. Had it been written today, or
written now.
would people on Twitter, if people on Twitter found it today, you've got white supremacy, you've got cisgenderism, you've got sexism, you've got all kinds of highly problematic things. And the eyes thing, that was actually one of the first things that I kind of perked up, and I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be problematic. Because I think the lightness of the eyes was a reference to Blue Eyes. And I believe there were some sequels where they make it abundantly clear that these blue-eyed people are somehow, like, that is the color of their eyes, that they're blue eyes, and that they have some kind of magical power. And as far as, like, the magical power goes, I was actually going to ask if any of you knew if this book was in any way influenced by Rupert Sheldrake. Do you know
that I am not
morphic
aware
fields
of,
or anything like that? No, Mom.
That I am not aware of.
Not that I'm
I would
aware
have
of.
to do some research
I missed
on
the last little part.
Yeah.
Influenced by what?
Rupert Sheldrake, I believe his name's Rupert. I have to look it up again. The guy who does the morphic fields thing. If you've ever heard of that, maybe it's just me. I could just be. I could just be going off on a.
I've not heard
here.
that. Yeah,
but because because I was reading it. I mean, there's definitely it's definitely strange and magical. It's not really explained how this giving power works exactly. It's like you lay on hands, and all of a sudden all the memories come, and then you have to keep the memories, and then if you leave the town, all the memories come back, and it's definitely some kind of magical thing. And I know there's
kind of telepathic feel.
There's a
kind. Yeah.
Yeah, like a telepathic field, and there was a like psychologist, chemist guy, scientist guy who has a theory of morphic fields where there's like an ancestral memory that permeates reality, and that certain people can have access to these ancestral memories based on, you know, like psychic powers, or people accessing these ancestral memories or something. And it just sounded very Sheldrakean, I guess. And I wasn't sure if that was deliberate or if that was just me. Maybe I'm reading too much into it.
Like, you have to wonder.
Maybe she just thought it was a cool idea.
You have a fantasy element. Yep. You have to wonder, like, how much of that is the author referencing, you know, like, kind of like weird, you know, philosophers who are interested in the occult, and how much of that is just an author saying, wouldn't it be cool if we had this magic power? Because there are different styles of writing. Like, I feel like, you know, kids especially, they just come up with magic powers all the time. And, you know, for J.K. Rowling, she actually, like, researched the occult to add some occultic elements to the Harry Potter universe. So, you know, it could be possible.
Really? I didn't know.
Yeah, she lived near an occultic bookstore. So, the fundies were right about Harry Potter.
The fundies were right.
The fundies are right. Yeah. I was going to say that I could be remembering wrong, but I think back in the 90s, to get to your question of why was this book banned, I think one of the reasons was that the fact that there was a mention in it of emergent sexuality.
Yeah, the sort of coming of age stuff where he's getting the erotic dreams about his friend, and then they have to chemically castrate him because, you know, that sex is bad,
right.
And, you know, you can't have boobs in comic books or anything. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, and, you know, this was back in the 90s. So in the 90s, you know, there was a lot more, you know, conservatism around that was sensitive to those sorts of things. In the more traditional sense of, no, you can't have sex in kids' books, rather than in the sense of, oh, this is, you know, cis, hetero, patriarchal, blah, 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 SJW nonsense. No, it's just
it's objectifying 12s or 11s, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it wasn't like that. It was just, it was more like, ooh, she's, you know, the kid is having erotic dreams in this book. We don't want our kids to read that. Like, but I mean, nowadays you read something like that and you say, boy, this is remarkably tame for a book that is targeted to that age of kid, like compared to the YA books that come out now.
I was thinking that,
yeah.
I was thinking that too. I remember those sections.
The way Lowry did it was remarkably subtle.
Freud would have had a field day with that whole sequence.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that was.
But speaking of,
that was actually. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
sorry,
speaking of
go for it.
erotic dreams. Yeah, speaking of erotic dreams, that that brings up one of the features of this world that Lowry has created is the fact that it is very it's implied to be sex negative. That one of the things that they have to do in order to make this utopia work, this quote utopia work, is they have to suppress the natural biological urges that people have to basically congress with each other in unpredictable ways, right? So what I was saying, what I said to Marm over DM about what I thought was what was the central thing that was being idolized, because in each dystopia, he was saying in his video when he was talking about the graphic novel, in each dystopia you have that one or two things that the dystopia idolizes above all else, and that's what makes it dystopic. It's not a balanced vision of the universe. It's focusing on one particular thing, and one or two particular things that they're basically elevating as more important than anything else. And I think that what the world and the giver idolizes above all else is number one, order. They basically structured the society in such a way to basically remove all aspects of unpredictability. So they drug you so you don't have those unpredictable sexual feelings that are going to cause you to do things that will mess up the perfect order that they have created. And everything else is strictly planned by a central council of elders instead of people making unpredictable choices on their own. So that's
basically
all.
No chaos and no dragons.
No chaos and no dragons. Yeah. to get Petersonian. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I'd agree with that.
Extreme
it's
order.
the ultimate nanny state. It's the
yeah
great bin the knife state, I guess.
Yeah.
I actually found it really interesting when what was his name, Jonas, when he was having the discussions with the giver, and every time he learns something new, right, he doesn't just have this great revelation about it. He learns it, but then his programming kind of kicks in, and he starts finding ways to rationalize why, the thing shouldn't be. And I remember one thing that really stood out to me was when the giver. This is Suma's spoiler room, right? So we can spoil the book. 30-year-old young adult book with like 5 people watching. Okay, get spoiled.
Yeah.
When the giver's talking about his very favoritist memory, which was like these Christmas celebrations from the before and before and before, and Jonas notices these candles, and he's like, oh, there's open flames, and well, I suppose it would be really dangerous to allow families to just have open flames in their houses, so of course it has to be banned, right? We got to get rid of Christmas because families are allowed to have flames, and this is he's getting all these things in, and he's learning all these new things, but the way society has trained him to think is in this very like health and safety. Everything's got to be, you can't hurt yourself, you can't take risks, you can't challenge yourself. As soon as you see that open flame or the knife or anything that's not a bicycle, right? An airplane comes overhead and you gotta be because that might cause harm, that might challenge things. It might result in like the one kid who died, by falling into the river like 8 years ago that everybody remembers still because it was the one time, something horrible happened in sight of people, not withstanding, all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes with, the euthanasia and the women's bodies are their own choice stuff. It's totally acceptable to not going to say anything bad about abortion, but you know what I mean. All that release stuff going on in the background that nobody knows
to
about.
protect people, you have to protect people from themselves.
Right. Right.
And maybe like when I brought up, like the Huxley and George Orwell earlier, like something I was trying to get at is what's weird is that Gibber's different from those. So maybe in contrast to Huxley, like the way of protecting everybody from themselves is they have sexual communism. Everybody's having sex with everybody else all the time until sex becomes meaningless. Whereas in the Giver, no one is having sex whatsoever. You're prevented from expressing that at all. So it's like they're completely opposite solutions to the problem of people being free and hurting themselves. But the connection I'm seeing is that both of them are about governments that try to fix the problem of sex being dangerous in different ways. You can fix the problem by sex becoming so omnipresent it doesn't mean anything anymore, or you could fix the problem by becoming so puritanical no one can even have sex.
Right. Warsword says, in my humble opinion, SJW Twitter is way worse than the religious right ever was. The religious right never got anything totally banned. Quite true. Quite true.
One of the worst examples I've seen is the Boulder edition of Shakespeare. So everybody says like it's Boulderized if you leave certain things out. Where all he really did was he published a version of Shakespeare, but he left out all the naughty sex jokes so kids could read Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I mean, would the kids even be able to understand the sex jokes, though? I mean, it's kind of above their reading level. I think if you're old enough to read and comprehend what Shakespeare's saying, you're old enough to get the sex.
You're old enough
jokes,
for the sex
even
jokes.
if you're not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. But
well, Punchy, you're speaking in a time period where kids don't really learn to read anymore, so. That's why you're coming at it from that perspective.
Interestingly enough, that's actually something else that really struck me about the book reading through it, was just how erudite everyone was. I was actually kind of shocked by the way they were treating language. And that actually kind of gets into the white supremacy stuff and the pre 1984 stuff that I was thinking about too. So I'm going to try not to go onto a tangent right now, maybe later, but just real quick, because in regards to the language,
expand on it a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, just in regards to language specifically, because everyone is very concerned with precision and meaning and proper words, and they're doing things like drawing distinction between distraught and distracted. And I mean, you can do that, obviously, but it's not something that I think like 11-year-olds are going to do very often, like today, let alone back in the day. And like distraught, I can't even remember the last time I've heard someone use distraught in like vernacular speech. So certainly not recently. So, and the interesting thing about that. Just in regards to all of these utopian, dystopian novels is, there's this overall theme of language and control of language and how controlling language can control thought, right? I mean, that's certainly a theme in 1984 where, the destruction of language is meant to narrow thought down so that it's not just that you have to obey the party because the party will kill you and torture you if you don't. It's you will obey the party because there's no way for you to conceive of anything outside of what the party says. Right? So they go about doing that by destroying language. But here in The Giver, they're not destroying language. They're trying to get you to think really carefully about language and be very precise about language and use your language in the right way. Right. So that was kind of an interesting.
But you have no memory associated with the words. The words are supposed to evoke your ideas or your experience. That's what we're using language for. We're using language to kind of try to communicate to others what's going on in our heads. They've lost the experience of snow. They've lost the experience of warmth and love. So the words are now just technical words that might be antiquated or that they don't need anymore. So we don't love you. We enjoy you. We are proud of you. We appreciate you as family. Yeah.
Yeah, but that too. That was another interesting thing, because going into it, I didn't realize that everything was black and white, and again, spoilers. Everything's black and white. Nobody can actually have feelings, right?
Yeah.
So as it was gradually revealed that in fact there was no color in this world, or they weren't able to perceive color, and there were no feelings in this world, I was like, oh, all right, that makes sense, because at first they had like these airings of feels, right? They're sitting around as families, and one of the rituals in this society is getting in touch with your feels. And I don't know if this is a big thing on like conservative land or anything, but like I grew up in very lefty circles and very sort of new age circles, and this like getting in touch with your feels is a big thing. It's big with the SJs as well right now. You're very, very touchy-feely. You express your feelings. You sit down and you hash out the feelings, right? I don't know. Are you guys familiar with this cultural ritual or anything?
See, I feel like it's not. There is like a cultural, maybe like conservative bias that rubs some dirt in it, right? Like so it's a stereotype that isn't always true, but I think it is generally true that like a little conservative family probably isn't going to say, tell us how you feel today. But in any culture where like the family is talking to each other, I feel like that's going to come up naturally. My take on that whole the family talking about feelings scene was that for them, talking about feelings is something they do based on like the ritual. So it's sort of like this cold logical, well, of course we have to talk about feelings. That's part of what we need to do if we're going to operate efficiently. So it's almost like they feel like they need to do it, so they go through it by rote.
It felt
very,
to me.
very logical.
It felt to me very performative. Like they were talking about their feelings, but their feelings were not real feelings. In a way, they were attenuated, very severely attenuated emotions because of the structuring of the society and the way that the society basically discourages any kind of real chaotic responses to anything. So I as Marm says, I thought that was ritual and not really a genuine get in touch with your feelings situation. And in the same way, the way that everyone in the society always apologizes to each other when they're late or they make someone uncomfortable or whatever strikes me also as extremely performative. Yeah, it's not coming from any genuine. It's not coming from any genuine remorse for what they have done. It's just something that they have learned how to do as a performance to keep things in control. And when I read the graphic novel this week, I immediately thought about the Twitter SJs and how they're always demanding you to apologize for things. and I feel like that if we were to allow them to take over our society and bring things to their logical conclusion, we would have a society very much like The Giver, in which people just automatically apologize for things in a performative way because, oh God, I don't want to be canceled, you know?
Something that occurred to me.
Yeah, please don't send me to the cancel chamber.
So, something that occurred to me is one of the reasons I like The Giver is I couldn't map it onto a right-left, like it's not like it's a political cartoon. My initial thought was, this is going to be like a commentary on whiteness as a culture. And you could read it this way if you put on the woke problematic glasses. You could read this as a way of saying that the white suburban family values culture could become a kind of a trap that robs you of your spirit or robs you of your soul. But then we also see sort of the SJW dimension of it, where the SJW culture has very exacting rules of fake politeness. So maybe kind of like as a testament to this as a work of literature, I feel like you could enter into it and see elements of both parties basically at work in this world. And you could see how this is a threat, like it's what it's warning us against could be a threat to people on either side of the political aisle. Maybe if you were worried about the religious right being this way in the 80s, maybe now you're more worried about the new secular left becoming more like this way in the 20s. But that's just basically a mark, I think, of good literature. Is it speaks beyond just one party.
Right.
It's timeless. Timeless.
Right.
Themes.
Exactly.
Right. When I was reading the graphic novel this week to see how the graphic novel compared, I put in the description the word safetyism because that's what immediately came into my mind this week in today's context was this society is structured in such a way that no one ever feels pain, right? Which it's the ultimate safetiest society. So that's what in my head, that's what I immediately connected to is today we seem to be trending towards this idea that no one should ever suffer any discomfort or pain or adversity of any kind. We must bubble wrap every person so that they can never get sick. They can never die at an untimely point, you know. This week I was seeing it as a logical extension of where we seem to be headed right now, in which where we seem to be headed right now is this idea that hundreds of thousands of people dying means that the entire society should stop because no one should ever die when they're not supposed to. It feels like just right now, The Giver feels like an extension of that. Now, when I read the novel back when I was a teenager, I was obviously thinking about different things because that was a completely different context, which just again goes to what Mom was saying about how it's really getting at universal tendencies in human thought that can lead us astray, basically.
Yeah, well, again, I just freshly read the book, so it's very fresh in my mind. But the word that they use to describe their own first principle is sameness. This comes up quite a lot. It's their one like philosophy or religion is sameness. So I mean, you guys might have a different take on it, but I think that definitely gets to these connections to, like social justice, for example, because sameness and equality, is in the same boat. Everybody has to do the same thing, right? Everything is gray. Everybody, it's all sameness, and even your feelings are the same, right? Your life is the same, and everything is unchanging, generation after generation. So
and then one badass 90s kid on a skateboard has to rebel against the system.
Yeah. Then he finds out about the abortion clinic and raids Planned Parenthood and runs and dies in the snow.
I mean,
It's a
essentially,
good
yes,
anime
that's the story. Yeah.
Well, okay, I'm to segue. I guess I'm jumping ahead, Suma Tangentum, but we eventually find out that Jonas's dad is a caretaker. He's a nurturer, but he executes the babies. He releases the babies if there are too many babies or if they're found to be defective. What kind of weirded me out about it is I kind of can't help but look at that as a strong parallel to something like partial birth abortion, like to the point, like how could you write something like that without maybe consciously being aware of that parallel? We don't need to be in our society anymore. It's a burden. And what's really tragic about it is that the nurturer, we feel like he's a very caring guy. Like he's a dad he seems like a nice soy boy house husband at first, who's just caring for babies all the time. And when you find out that he kills these babies too, it just brings home the point that he just has a complete mental separation between taking care of babies and doing what he needs to do to, I guess, keep the community going.
Yeah, exactly like a soy boy house husband. He looks nice on the outside, but then he goes off and kills the babies. I mean, that's not really contradictory. That's just a character study.
But then the tragedy of it, he took in this baby on purpose for months to save it. So you can tell that he would prefer to not have to kill this baby and even make some sacrifices to try to help this baby stay alive. But if the community says he has to kill it, then he does it, and he sings a little nursery rhyme as he does it. That's it's sadism combined with like, if this guy wasn't born in this community, you feel like he would have been a great dad, but it just so happens that that's how this community has molded him his entire life, to the point that he doesn't even think about it.
Yeah, well, he doesn't have the capacity to have feelings anymore, does he? I mean, he doesn't even know what feelings are. Those have been bred out of him from a very early age. So, as far as he knows, he's doing great things, and the baby's happy, and the baby's fine, and hey, you're just going on a little trip down the garbage chute, whistle, 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 right? Yeah. He doesn't even think that could be wrong. And that was actually something that again, I wish I had gone and done some more research. But in 1993, was that was before Dr. Death, right? Or around the Dr. Death time?
Kevorkian?
Yeah,
Kevorkian?
And a lot of like abortion stuff. Because I know back in the 90s, that was a hot button issue.
That was late. That was 1999, so it was before Kevorkian.
Okay, it was a little bit before, but yeah, I mean, I know like the 90s, they had a lot of this kind of social discussion about euthanasia and abortion and when. Oh yeah, I definitely was too late for abortion and all this stuff. So, so that again, that was one of the things that I thought might be a little bit problematic and would definitely get it kicked out. That in the cisgenderism. I know Marmaduke had mentioned a few minutes ago about like a critique of suburbia. I actually, I mean, I kind of got that from the book. I don't think it was really a critique of suburbia so much, but there was a movie that I saw quite a while ago that kind of reminded me of The Giver. Do any of you remember or know what I'm talking about? It was like all black and white, and then like all the teenagers found out that. Yeah, I think that was it. I mean, it was a different kind of story. Like the answer to everyone's problems wasn't go raid the Planned Parenthood. The answer was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But it kind of took a similar setup with a different kind of moral message, right? And that movie was definitely a critique of kind of white suburbia. The thing with The Giver, I think it was actually more about the conflict between reason and romanticism. And I can go into that if you want, but it might take a little bit for me to make my case.
I think that's. I think you might actually be right about that.
Oh God, thank God.
So if you would like to expand, if you would like to expand upon that, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me see here. I brought up the feelings, right? Like the whole feelings thing. Because I know, like with hindsight, yeah, I know that they didn't have feelings and that they were rationalizing their feelings. But at the time, again, I didn't know how it was going to end. I didn't realize that they were rationalizing their feelings. But one of the things that really struck me was like how like logical positivist everything seemed. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like Bertrand Russell or any of these kinds of figures.
He's famous. I think he's most famous for writing "Why I'm Not a Christian." Is that right? Is that the right guy?
Yeah. Was it? I think that was Russell. Hang on. Was either Russell or someone? I'm not. But he was an early 20th century. Yeah. It was Russell. He was like an early 20th century philosophy teacher. He's also a very big early proponent of the New World Order. In a completely non-ironic, non-Alex Jonesy way. He was a genuine supporter of world government and utopia. He believed that, one of the only ways to prevent things like world wars was to get a new world order that would step in and destroy sovereign governments and kind of control everybody, right, in a good scientific way. And this relates to a lot of these old, like early 20th century ideas, like technocracy and scientific management. I believe was a term that they used to use. Progressivism.
Yes.
The intellectuals can order society for us in a way that would eliminate war and suffering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You get the smartest people in the world, the philosopher kings that Plato was talking about. And they know what's best for people, so they can engineer the perfect society. And this is kind of the basis for utopia. It's the basis for utopian novels. And it was kind of interesting because Russell was one of the major proponents of these ideas, one of the major figures in this intellectual milieu of people exploring utopias and different ways to organize society. And but he was a very big proponent of precision in language and precision with philosophy. There's this English tradition associated with like Russell and Wittgenstein, for example. That you guys are familiar with like French philosophy and like
I've read like the comic book adaptations of the French philosophers.
Or like postmodernism.
I talk about this stuff a lot, but most of my knowledge of this stuff came from me like learning about modern and postmodern art, and I thought, why is modern art and postmodern art like that? So I read a little bit to like get a familiar, right? Yeah, so I'm basically familiar with what you're talking about. Yeah.
So it's well, the English kind of went a different way from the French. They weren't
more pragmatic,
like this French company. I guess you could say more pragmatic, more logical and more reasonable, right? Like one of the things with these postmodern philosophies is that they want to destroy meaning and revel in absurdity and just kind of be you guys watch The Simpsons, right?
Right.
Where there was the episode where Mo Sizlak makes his postmodern bar, and he's like, "Oh, it's POMO, postmodern." Okay, weird for the sake of being weird, right? Like that's kind of the best definition I've heard. But these English guys, right? They were more pragmatic, I suppose, and they focused on trying to come up with universal laws based on axiomatic logical principles, right? There was Wittgenstein was the most famous individual who tried to do this. He wrote a book actually while he was in the trenches of World War One, where he'd kind of apply mathematical laws to philosophical postulates, I guess, right? Like trying to prove that the world is a certain way and that it can only be this certain way and that we can know all things and we can come up with all sorts of philosophical ideas just based on logical rules and mathematical rules, right? That we can infer from the other logical rules and other mathematical rules.
Right. You're trying to take empirical data and filter philosophy through an empirical framework.
Not even kind of, yeah, but not even necessarily an empirical framework, because empirical framework would require that you get some like evidence, right? Go out and find evidence. Like he wanted to find like a pure reason, right? Like you can know that 1 + 1 = 2 just based on the axiomatic laws of math, right? And they were trying to do that with language and philosophy, and they never quite succeeded. But one of the things that they were really big on, right, was this idea that we have to be very precise about what we mean when we say things. And oddly enough, like that's something that a lot of like postmodernists sort of get into too. But you know, there's like a joke about 20th century philosophy, and it goes something like, I mean, it's not a very funny joke, but it's something like, well, what did you learn in the 20th century in philosophy? And it's like, well, what do you mean what? What do you mean we? What do you mean learn? Right?
Yeah.
Definitions. Yeah.
Yeah, everything has to be definitions.
Depends what the meaning of
anyways, getting back
is.
to the giver. Yeah, depends. Exactly. It's that kind of stuff. And getting back to the giver, like the fact that they were so concerned with finding precise meanings for the words that they were using and the precise meaning of language really reminded me of that kind of logical positivist approach to life and language. It's almost like autistic in a way, right? Like you're trying to find a formula for everything and come up with the exact engineered thing in itself, right? If that makes any sense.
Okay, I want to kind of try to bring this back into the arts so I can see if I can understand what you're saying through something I'm more familiar with. So maybe the parallel to this would be in poetry or in painting. You'd have the realists, and the realists would want to represent everything with like exhaustive detail. So Sir Walter Scott writes Ivanhoe, and he wants all of the language of the characters to be historically accurate. He wants the harsh lives of the serfs to be represented in a lot of detail. Whereas with romantic poetry or romantic art, you might have more of an idea of a man. My favorite romantic painting, I think, is just a man staring out over an ocean, and it's sort of like he's enraptured by just like the view of the ocean filling his in his entire field of vision. So with the romantics, it's more like get back to nature, allow the senses to speak, allow your emotions or your beliefs or your private inner life to be expressed through the art, which is a very different writing style than, you know, kind of like harsh, detailed, very exact language describing like the pain of life in a more realist approach to writing or a more realist approach to painting. And then maybe like I feel like maybe like since then we've been trying to like put the two of them together. Like the romantics could go off into La La Land and just be in a world of pure emotion, and the realists could go off into a world of just more and more exact persnickety details. And like just speaking for myself personally, you kind of prefer an art, or whether it's comics or whether it's music or whether it's literature, you kind of prefer it to see someone who can find a balance of the two, like connect to human feeling in a way that we connect with, right? That we feel that, but also like not be completely separate from reality, not be so abstract or so distant from us we can't even interpret what you're saying.
So would it be fair to say that you're then saying that there's like a tension between these two camps, like the realists and the romantics, and that you're either in one camp or the other, and you might have some crossover, but there's like an inherent tension between these two.
I think there's a sort of tension between the two, but there's like also a possibility to learn from the two. So if Ben Shapiro says facts don't care about your feelings, right? Then Andrew Klavan can come back and say, well, feelings don't care about your facts, right? Like if you want to communicate to people who don't understand anything about economics, you can't pull out an economics chart and say, okay, we should be capitalist because it will increase our GDP by 0.02% over any socialist system. Like you'd want to, if you wanted to be, you want to communicate capitalism to people in a way that makes sense to stupid people who don't care about economics, basically. And one way to do that would be through kind of like by speaking to them personally, right? Speaking to their stories.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's actually that Shapiro quote is actually pretty good for The Giver. Because again, as I was reading this, all these things about Burt and Russell was going through my head, and at the time, I genuinely thought they were having feelings, and I was like, well, that's weird. They're hyper rational, but they're also hyper feely, and facts don't care about your feelings. Like this tension between realism and logic and reason and romanticism on the other side. And as an art nerd myself, I've always been interested in that kind of the fights between the realists and the romantics, and the New Agers and the scientists. These different camps, and I've never really resolved it in my head which side I like more. But as The Giver went on, right, it becomes very apparent that they don't have these feelings, that there is no romanticism in their society, and that the problem is that, yes, in fact, they are hyper logical, and this has killed their capacity for having any kind of feeling and having any kind of natural existence. And I know
or genuine wisdom.
You just mentioned, I suppose, because they don't have the feelings to kind of help them make decisions. But Marmaduke had mentioned like romanticism and its theme of like getting back to nature, right? Which ties in very neatly with the end of the book. Because as Jonas, he's escaping from society. He's grown up in this Midgard, right? This world inside the enclosure that's old society, and it's the town, and it's the village. There's a river at the end that a bridge that you never cross, and everything is just the world of humans and order. And then at the end of the book, he has to go out on this adventure into the unknown, into the wilds, into the cold and the snow and the forests and everything, and this romantic journey into the sublime, the beautiful but scary nature, right? So that's why I was thinking, one of the major themes was this tension between reason and romanticism. I think the author was probably very keenly aware of other utopian books and the history of like utopian thought, and she may have been trying to point out that, look, if we have a society that's too rational and too reasonable, that we're going to wind up having a society where nobody has any feelings, and then everyone's, well, they're not going to be miserable, but they're going to turn into monsters, and it would be up to you to break free and to run off so that you can feel pain again, right?
Right.
So maybe like for I haven't read Sir Thomas More's Utopia, but I know that it involves him like discovering like an island community, and then he describes the nature of their community. So there's kind of like this element that the point of the story is he gets away from like the civilized Catholic world and finds like maybe this primitive, isolated people on their own island who've developed the perfect culture. So like the thread is, we got to get away from, we built all this modern stuff to protect us from nature, to keep nature from killing us. But now that we feel like this longing for nature, we have to go back out into nature to maybe find whatever this perfect community or this perfect way of living might be. And again, this is something I've seen kind of like on the left and the right. Like Tolkien has a little element of this where he suspects that the goblins are the creators of modern culture, and the goblins are the creators of black powder and explosives. But there's also kind of like maybe like this primitivist, maybe like primitivist socialist wing where it's like our modern culture is hurting Mother Earth. If we want to be at one with Mother Earth again, we have to give up the conveniences of modern culture and civilization and return to harmony. It's a big question: is do you think that the cavemen were all living in harmony with nature, or do you think the cavemen were basically just miserable and killing each other all the time? And your answer to that question probably says a lot about your worldview.
Yes. I'm thinking now of a podcast I listened to a little while ago with Jordan Peterson. And one of the things that he said in that podcast that I think is interesting and germane to this discussion is he was talking about the difference between an ideology and an actual complete worldview. And he said the difference is that ideologies have very unbalanced views of nature, of society, and of the individual. So, and the way he explained it, he said that, nature has many positive and restorative things about it, but nature is also red and tooth and claw and chaotic and dangerous, and could hurt you, right? Similarly, society has much to recommend it because when you are in society, in a functional society anyway, you are protected, right, from the possible chaotic elements of nature and so on. But at the same time, society can be very restrictive and very tyrannical if it goes too far in one or another direction. So society has that capacity to be both tyrannical but also very protective and good. And then at the same time, the individual, right, can be the individual the individual person has much that is good, has many impulses that are good, but he also has those impulses that are evil, like in the Jewish idea of you have the evil impulse and the good impulse. And what he said is that an ideology leads, one or other half of the dual nature of those three things. So an ideology would say that nature is always and ever good, right? Whereas a complete and balanced worldview recognizes that nature has good and bad aspects to it. Or an ideology would say, go ahead.
So what's interesting about that is sort of the contrast between worldview as a concept and ideology as a concept. Like one of the things about the word ideology is, I think it's a word where you can, it's one of these words that has a very negative connotation to it. Like your ideology is bad. You're only saying that because of your ideology. And I've always assumed they were kind of like synonyms, but with just different, like one has a more positive connotation, one has a more negative connotation, where they're both ideology and a worldview could be described as a collection of ideas. And we say that's an ideological argument as a negative when we mean something like you're only arguing that because it fits within your ideological framework. The second you step out of that ideological framework, your argument would fall apart. It doesn't really work anymore. But I guess the same thing could apply to worldview. So like my understanding of worldview is I think like the Punchy asked earlier about like the religious right, at least in my experience, like the religious right is very fascinated with conversations of worldview. And I think it was fascinated with a conversation about worldview, like going back before like the modern culture war, like going back to the 70s and 80s. A lot of the first generation of fundamentalists were very interested in the conversation of worldview. And so I'm mostly thinking like Francis Schaeffer, right? So Francis Schaeffer was kind of like one of the intellectual founders of sort of like evangelical Protestantism in America. So all of his books were about basically the importance of worldview questions and getting back to kind of like your primary answers, your answers to these primary questions that guide everything else. So it's sort of, I don't know. I've sort of felt like the rest of the culture came around and started talking to the religious right again. Maybe like in the most recent wave of political correctness might have forced that conversation to start up again. So I guess my only like kind of like response to what you're saying is, I think you said Peterson was the one who was making that contrast, right?
Yeah.
Or who was that was Jordan Peterson?
It was Jordan Peterson. So he is very clearly defining ideology as an unbalanced worldview. Okay. Not just generally a worldview. Yeah.
That's useful to me because I'd heard him talk about ideology before, and he kind of has, I guess, maybe a little bit more of a classical liberal perspective where he's suspicious of ideologies and he's suspicious of frameworks because they can be wrong, but he also thinks they're important because they can provide structure. So it's interesting to me that his distinction is the ideology is something that has an incomplete perspective. Maybe it focuses on just one thing, and the worldview is more interested in trying to focus on everything and put it all together into one picture. I think I'd agree with that as a working definition, because then it basically helps explain. It's a way of explaining why do we have a negative connotation with the word ideology, and I think it would be ideology has a negative connotation if you are fixating on exactly one point. That point could even be true. But if you make that point central to everything, you're going to go off into la la land. You could have a good argument against capitalism, but if the only thing that you believe or think about is how bad capitalism is, you could go into any number of weird directions starting from that point.
Yeah, I'm just picturing Mikey and Marmaduke sitting around the dinner table having the discussion about the precision of language, trying to hash out whether they do you really mean worldview? Maybe you mean ideology. Is ideology the right word?
Right. We need the giver to give us the feeling for these words so we can really understand.
Yeah. You need to feel it, man. Just relax. Just go with the flow, right? And this is kind of why I actually tend towards the more logical side. Like, I like to be able to have precision in language, but someone like Jordan Peterson, you especially see it in like academics, right? Like, they will try to be very precise about the language they use, to the point where what they're saying isn't necessarily what you think they're saying. Because they're using language in a way that's very technical and very controlled, and it's completely different from the way that a normal person would talk, right? Like, he might say ideology and mean this one specific thing, whereas somebody else goes off and uses the word ideology that means something completely different. And maybe even a different academic uses the word ideology and means something completely different, and they have to have conversations about what the word means. Right?
Peterson's trapped in this Twilight Zone episode where he's trying to use explicitly the clearest language he possibly can, and every interviewer misunderstands him all the time.
Yeah, well, that's I think that might be one of the reasons why it's so hard to have feelings with precise language, because you're spending so much mental power trying to make sure that your language is right and that you're getting the right word, and you don't have any time to actually feel it, because that was also something that really struck me when I was reading the book. There was one specific instant. I think, was it when he was shot and dying or something, or it was one of the horrible things he was experiencing. But the author mentioned that Jonas wasn't able to articulate his feeling anymore, right? Like, he was just reacting to it. Right. And I think that's, as somebody who has had experiences where, it's really bad. Like, you can say, oh yeah, this is really bad. But when it gets really bad, that's when, like, you can't even describe it, right? It's just happening and you're just feeling it, right? So I thought that was kind of interesting. Like the closer you are to the feeling, the less able you are to articulate it. Even, like, disregard precise articulation, you aren't able to articulate it at all, right? So
right.
Yeah, right. It'd be like, it's like the difference. Oh, okay, I'll be an egghead, right? So Plato has, like, this idea of the pure form, right? So if you look at geometry, you've got this pure idea of what a triangle is. if you try to make a triangle out of sticks, it's going to be shit. It's going to be shitty, basically. So we imitate these pure forms in our regular life. We try to make something that's close to the ideal form that we have in our head, but we because we're imperfect, we never get close to it. So for this, the word to describe the feeling is a way of trying to get at that pure form of the feeling. But the closer you get to the pure form of it, the less useful the logical language is to describe what you're getting at.
So would you then say that language is like the shadow on the wall? The shadow on the wall of the cave.
Yeah, I love that metaphor, and it's kind of interesting that I think like Christians like Augustine helped popularize Plato. Like these intellectual Christians wanted to read all of these Greeks, and like for Augustine, he was trying to, I think, like put together his love for Plato with his newfound interest in Christianity. When he thought he was, I love Augustine because he was sort of like a proto fedora tipper, where he was part of like this hip called the Manichees, and they were just so much smarter than those dumb Christians. We Manichees, we love the science. We know all about astrology, and hashtag the science loves astrology. And Augustine reached this point where he met like the guru of the Manichees. He just thought he was an idiot, and he was completely unimpressed. So that I think that life experience for Augustine.
He was a very smart person. Like James Lindsay talks about capital V, capital S, capital P, very smart people.
Yeah.
In a very sarcastic way. Yeah.
Right.
Is that the translation from the Wokish guy, or what was it?
The guy who translates the Wokish. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, he's good. He does some good work.
Well, I think the connection I was trying to make a connection there, and I lost it. It's gone. It's poofed into the stratosphere.
It's gone back into the before and before and before. You gave away the fields to somebody else, and now it's.
Except we're all just more muddled and confused now.
Yeah. But no, I think that ultimately, noticing the tension that we have here between the super rational, super planned, super ordered society and the wild outdoors is in fact an intentional tension that is being set up in this novel. And I think it's meant to remind us, I think, like I haven't interrogated the author to figure out what she intended exactly, but I suspect that what she intended was to say that there needs to be a balance between the rational and the logical and the planned and the ordered and the things that are chaotic and unplanned and more free. As we were talking about language being the shadow on the wall and so on, I couldn't help but think back to what I learned in college, because my major was neuroscience. And our brain is kind of, it's a little bit simplistic to say that it's divided into the logical versus the feeling halves of the brain, because both halves do pretty much everything. But the left half does specialize in language and in breaking things down into their logical components and so on, whereas the right half seems to be a little more specialized in noticing where the body is in space, noticing kind of the overall gestalt of the situation, and is not, for most people, the verbal part of the brain. So the fact that we see in our philosophy, like in our human philosophy, in the fights that arise between logic and reason and enlightenment and romanticism, I think is kind of a reflection of our brains themselves, almost, because our brains are kind of in that eternal conflict between what's going on in the general environment versus what can I analyze and break down. the other thing about
Hey, sorry to
language being
interrupt.
the shadow on the wall is
I think people were breaking up, and I think Marmaduke has been punted. I don't know if you have to let him back in, or what's going on.
oh yeah, let me let him back in. Okay. Okay, Marmaduke, can you hear us?
Yep, no more timeout for me.
Okay.
Punchy moved to the
Marmaduke,
middle
don't
now.
wait.
See, we played musical
Haha.
chairs.
Aha. I am next to you.
Ah.
Now I'm the far right and he's the fence sitter.
Yeah, now
And
I'm the
on
neutral party.
I'm on
I'll
the
have to
left.
Left geek.
change my idea.
Left geek. I'm the left geek. Yeah. Well, okay. So I was saying that language is also a late evolutionary development, and I think that's why we often experience language as a poor way to express what's going on in our heads, because language is so late. We only developed language a couple, we don't know exactly when language developed, but it was, some thousands of years ago, but in evolutionary time, it was basically a second ago, right? So I think that's why we often experience language as being this poor substitute for what's really going on inside of us. And I think that's why maybe Lauren wants to interrogate the obsession with language in The Giver.
Well, when you say it's a poor way of describing what's going on inside our head, what do you mean by?
Yeah.
Is that me? Am I getting feedback? Hello.
I hear a little feedback.
Yeah, this
might be
kind
it might be coming from the right geek
slightly, yeah.
Okay, well, I was
Slightly
going to
a
ask
little bit.
for clarification and precision on what you mean by not being able to describe what's going on in our head, because I've always been of the mind that language is integral to thought. Obviously life can exist without language, but I think that when we think, when we're thinking in our heads, we're thinking using language, and we're thinking using the laws of language, and that without these kind of syntactic laws, our thinking is very much temporary and acting on instinct, right? So that's why I'm wondering, when you say like everything going on in our head, are you talking about like ideas themselves, or just like the complete totality of all the little neurons or whatever the hell it is in your brain going on?
I am talking about the totality of brain activity. And I'm talking specifically about the things that evolutionarily are prior to language. So the kind of older, more reptilian aspects of our brain.
Okay. Like such as, just some examples? Or?
Well, you are aware that like the frontal lobe, the cortex, developed on top of a lot of older structures that other animals have.
Yes, I'll say yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm talking about those older structures, like the limbic system, the kind of primitive brain structures that drive what Freud would call the id, for example. So the basic biological drives.
lizard brain, basically, to dumb it down.
Yeah. It's
Okay,
like literally the lizard brain. Yeah.
So like it's hard to describe our base instinctive feelings and urges and things that just kind of happen to us.
Eat, kill, need tomboy, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like maybe there's like a million different permutations of being hungry or something, but we only have like maybe 3 or 4 words to describe, like we have hungry and we have starving and things, but we don't have like a million words to describe something like that. Would that be?
Yeah, something like that. And that actually comes up in The Giver too, when he says, one time when he was a kid, he said he was starving. Yeah. Yeah. And they said, no,
he doesn't understand
language. You are not starving. Yeah. 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 So it's a society it's a society that disallows hyperbole.
Yeah, because that was specifically something that I'm sure every kid has heard it. Like you tell your mom or your dad or something, "Oh, I'm starving," and they're like, "You're not starving. You don't know what starving is." So I thought it was funny at first, but then you think about it in the like it's a familiar trope, right? But then you start thinking about it in the context of the utopian world in which they live, and you're like, like it feels warm and fuzzy, but then it feels kind of, scuzzy when you start thinking about it. And then, of course, it comes full circle, like a Chekhov's gun kind of thing. Except now it's like Chekhov's dying of starvation in the woods, right at the end.
Yeah.
So I thought that was clever. I mean, it's, the book was full of like little clever things like that. Like it wasn't a very long read.
So I take it you interpret the ending as they starve to death or they die of exposure?
No, well, I actually cheated and I looked up the Wikipedia article afterwards, and apparently he wrote 2 other books. This was actually how I knew that, in fact, their eyes were blue. Like I'd assumed that they were blue, which, interestingly enough, I think that blue in like Old Germanic was actually described as light. Like there was a color light, like there wasn't a color blue, there was a color light or something like that. I'd have to go back and look it up. But
like if you associate it with the sky, that would make sense.
Yeah, like the lightness of the eyes. And they'd mentioned that, and they mentioned that there were 2 other books in the series where they get more into like these kind of blue-eyed kids doing stuff. And apparently Jonas did survive, like he found some other community and there's some other stuff going on. Like I don't know all the details, but I do know like he doesn't actually die. I mean, if I had just read the book, like 30 years ago, I would have been like, oh yeah, okay.
Okay, so funny story. My mom reads the book and she says, I asked her, how do you think it ends? She says, well, he found the house and he found the loving home with the fire and everything. I said, oh, I thought it ended with him and the baby freezing to death in the cold. And the reason why is
apparently he does find a house with the fire.
Right. So I'll have to tell her that so she knows that it actually does have a happy ending. I was wrong. But one of the reasons I thought that is in P. Craig Russell's graphic novel, he chose to illustrate it with just like Jonas seeing like a bright abstract light, like he didn't draw the houses and everything. So it kind of like
sorry.
Go ahead.
I think P. Craig Russell interpreted it as they froze to death. Yeah.
I think P.K. Russell. Is that the furry with the pizza face that was defending Kiro the wolf, or
what?
It must be a different P.K. Russell. Oh god, Philip? Yeah, it's
Craig Russell. Yeah, that's the guy. I don't know if he's the furry guy or not.
Okay, sorry. There's a guy on YouTube called PK Russell.
Okay, not PK, P Craig with a G sound.
Okay, P Craig, it's different P Russell.
Different guy.
Sorry, he's a boomer, so he might not appreciate. If he knows what a furry is, he might not appreciate being called a furry.
Oh, God, this particular furry is just horrible. He's like do you guys remember Perez Hilton?
Yeah.
The Perez Hilton guy, the sort of really campy, flamboyant celebrity gossip guy. He's like that, but he's a furry and he defends zoo sadists, and he's horrible. So I did like a spit take when you mentioned him on the show.
Your knowledge of weird, crazy internet people is coming in.
Yeah, even comes into play here. It's everywhere.
It's either Bertrand Russell or it's Lol Cows on the internet.
Or it's PK Russell and Kira the Wolf. But yeah, no, as far as I know, was oh god, I can't imagine what people would be writing, if they were writing a dystopian novel now, or what dystopian novelists, if they came forward in time and saw all the craziness that was going on, what they would think of it. But yeah, as far as I know, Jonas is still alive. I don't know if he's like happy or anything. I haven't read the other books, but he is still around. And again, I got to emphasize, I really do think that there's some kind of weird white supremacist nonsense going on, because she does bring up this blue eyes stuff, and of course, there are like connections between like white supremacists and the sort of old Germanic romanticism, like back to nature kind of stuff. So that might just be my sort of lefty upbringing.
Well, why couldn't her be her criticizing and deconstructing white supremacy? No, that's the thing, is we always get trapped in this loop of, are you endorsing it or are you deconstructing
well, that's
it?
Actually good. We haven't done Brave New World yet, right? Or you guys?
No, that has not.
No, we have not.
Okay.
No.
Because I've actually got a Galaxy Brain take on Brave New World. That is sure to shock and appall people, but like I'm not going to go into it right now. But I definitely think that my interpretation of Brave New World, and I think the author's interpretation of Brave New World, is quite a bit different from the interpretation that other people have.
Your mind meaning out of it that the death of the author. He didn't intend it. You discovered the true meaning of Brave New World.
Well, no, I think he intended something. I think he intended something for most people to get out of it, but I think it was written as kind of like a reverse satire. God, what was it? The Jonathan Swift's
Gulliver's Travels, yeah.
Proposal.
Oh,
no,
the modest proposal. Yeah, we'll just eat the babies and everything will be okay.
Yeah. Set up Planned Parenthoods and eat Irish babies, right? And he's writing it very obviously as satire, where you're supposed to read it and be like, "Oh, that's horrible!" How could you believe it? Like, I think Brave New World might be one of those things where he's writing it and he wants you to think like, "Oh yeah, that's horrible," or he wants it to come off as like, "Oh yeah, that's horrible," but I think he wants you to come away from it thinking, you know what, that might not be so bad. But again, we can save that for later.
I feel
the thing that I was wondering, specifically in regards to The Giver, was whether or not Lowry, was it? Her name's Lowry, right?
Yeah, Lowry.
The author.
Lois Lowry.
Whether she was for the Giver Society or against the Giver Society, and whether she wanted us to side with the back to nature abortion clinic baby stealing renegade guy, or whether she wanted us to kind of side with the society and be like, the society's not that bad.
So what's interesting about this is how do you interpret an artist's intent? And I don't know. I would almost say,
and how do you interpret your own intent too?
Right. Well, I guess. Maybe like the problem is, so if you want to get all Bertrand Russell-y again, like you could get like super detailed, meticulous about it and try to like pick out individual words and phrases to try to pick that out. Or maybe you could do like that low IQ, high IQ meme and just like, what's your feeling about the story after you're done reading the story? Right? Like Robin Hood beats Little John, not Little John, Prince John. I think that Robin Hood is the hero of the story, right? Jonas escapes the weird culture where they have no color and kill babies. I think that Jonas is the hero of the story, right?
Yeah.
But he also gets all his friends to torture, and he abandons everyone, and he almost kills the baby. So it's very irresponsible of him, It's not quite as extreme as because that's why I was thinking about it, because it's not quite as extreme as the ending to Brave New World. Where I think it's very explicitly made that the people who are pro freedom are kind of chumps, but it still leaves it open to like maybe he didn't make the right decision, like maybe the them dying in the middle of a forest somewhere. I mean, the baby survived for a little bit longer, but it's not like trying to save the baby did anything good for him or anybody else, right? So that's why I was wondering. Like, I think on the whole, the impression that I got was, yes, she was siding with Jonas, and that Jonas is the hero, and that she is trying to say that this kind of society is bad. But it's not as clear cut as, say, like 1984, where you definitely come away with it being like, yeah, okay, Orwell is like he's scared shitless of this, and he wants us to be scared shitless of 1984 as well. The BBC is the devil, right? Don't go to the BBC. But I don't know.
Okay,
What did
I have
you
a
guys
question
get?
I've wondered about.
Did you think he was the hero?
Do you think that 1984 ends with Winston getting shot after they break him, or do you think it ends with him just being broken and being so effectively broken he can be reintroduced to society? Because I've seen like movie versions that have alternate takes on that.
Getting shot. I wasn't aware that he was shot.
I think there's a conversation
No,
where
I
they
wasn't aware
say
of that either. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going off dim memory, but I feel like there's maybe like a movie version where they talk about how they're going to execute him, but they need to break him before they execute him. And it's been too long since I read it to remember if that was just the movie version doing its own spin on things, because I always assumed that once they broke him, he could be reintroduced into society and they wouldn't have to even worry about it because their brainwashing is that effective. But I don't know. What I'm getting at is like the whole point is, what if the big question is, what if there was a tyranny so effective you just could not get out of it, period, and they could actually break you on the level of your soul and to make you part of it forever. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter whether he dies.
I think I don't remember exactly. It's been so long since I've read it, but I think there was an exchange like that when he was in the basement of the Ministry of Love, and he was being tortured, and his old buddy there was implying that like they could let him go and they could come for him at any time, and he could think that he was safe, and they could make him disappear, or they could kill him whenever. Right. I think there was a section like that. But the impression that I got, at least from the book, was that as soon as they broke him, like that was it. That was fine. I mean, they might have disappeared him later, because of course there's always that threat of liquidation for anyone. Like earlier in the book, Winston sees like the former revolutionaries who've been rehabilitated and they're kind of broken, and but he knows that eventually, they're going to just disappear too, right? Like people are going to forget about them, and then they're going to just vanish, and no one's going to know what happens to them. So, I mean, I guess it's possible. But as far as whether it happens or not, I mean, at the point that the book ends with him just sitting there in the pub, loving Big Brother, and cheering on the current year, I think it's he's already dead. Essentially.
Okay, so what's interesting about
whether
this
he's breathing or not is
you see a real clear intent in 1984, but are a little bit more on the fence for the giver, which is interesting to me. Like, what's the tell? Is the tell just that like you're left wondering at the end if the kid did what's right, taking this baby out of the community? But does the author give you a tell where you think she's saying, oh, maybe this isn't the best idea, or I guess that's where that's where I could just leave it, is if there is an easy way of spotting the author's intent or the author taking a side, like where do they let it slip?
Well, I would say that it was just how quickly Jonas came around. I mean, it could just be that it's a kid's book and that she has to fit it in like 50 pages. But he definitely, as soon as he started getting feelings, he was already, hey, this is the conflict. This is what I've got to do. This is my hero's journey. Blah blah blah. Boom 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 boom. Right. So just as far as like the author's intent, I definitely got that idea that she was saying, it's good for him to rebel against the society, and that the society isn't very nice, and he's got to kind of fight back against it and stop taking his sex pills and run away with Planned Parenthood baby.
I mean, he could have brought a map and a compass if he was going to run away.
Well, could he have though? Because did they have maps and compasses?
Oh yeah,
in his world.
They don't have anything in like they don't have anything in that library about like pre Utopia information.
I mean, I'm sure they do. They must have things about the before and before technology, but they didn't even know sleds at the time that this Jonas was running around. And it was funny because a lot of these utopian novels deal with technology, right? Like different levels of technology, and different ways that people use technology. But you get the sense that there is no technology anymore. There's just bicycles and houses, and they do mention that there are manufacturing centers and there are airplanes, but you don't really know where the airplanes are or where they're getting stuff or what stuff they drop off, right? Like they make supply runs, but the people in the society don't actually have any access to any technology beyond bicycles, as far as we know. And I think this gets into that idea of like the end of history. Like there is no past, there is no future, right? There's just the present. There's just the sameness of the present time. I know Jonas does at one point mention that people have to learn the new technology, but they don't have any memory of the time before, right? Like he doesn't remember his grandparents or his great or anything that happened before he was alive, right? And presumably nobody else does. So even if they're getting new technology, I mean, it might be one of those things where the authors just kind of didn't think it through and has like plot holes or something. But the impression I got was that it's intentionally kept at like no new technology. Everything's like a giant Amish village, basically. Like everyone's gone Amish.
It says, well, it says in the book that every time there is a consideration of a change, it goes to committee and just sits in committee forever and ever. That was that's a constant joke in the story.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe we can have the committee study it and see if they can change it. So, which again kind of supports my idea that what this society is kind of a description of a society that is overly obsessed with order and with control and the avoidance of chaos, or no dragons, as Marm said.
Yeah, never have the dragons. I mean, we might be able to get dragons, but we'd have to go to the committee and ask the committee to get the dragons, and then eventually they'd forget about the dragons. After
they'd bring a little stuffed animal and they'd assume that's what a dragon is.
Yeah, they're like, well,
it's
a fictional animal called a hippo, and a fictional animal called the dragon.
What was neat about the toy elephant scene is that kind of really brought home maybe like the gap between them and the old world, where she has a toy elephant and she loves the toy elephant, but she doesn't know what a real elephant is. Like we're left with a shadow of the former thing, or just like a simulacra, a copy of a copy of a copy of the thing.
Real.
Right.
Yeah, she doesn't even realize that it was real at one point. She thinks it's just a completely imaginary thing. Right? Like they mentioned that earlier on, like, oh, this was like a fictional animal called a horse, and this was a fictional animal called a hippo, and when he mentions that this elephant was real at some point, she's like, oh yeah, okay. Well, you're kind of crazy.
Yeah, sure. Whatever you say. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that whole thing with the committee too. Like I thought that was funny. Because it reminded me of like I mean, it's socialism basically, isn't it? Like you go to the government and you ask them to change things, and then they'll have this big committee to kind of decide it, and it gets stalled, and you got to wait on the government for everything. Do you guys know a channel, Voices of History, I think it's called?
Yeah, that guy, he'll do things like Japanese perspective on America, or English.
Voices of the Past.
Yeah. I love that channel. I want to do my own version of that channel, but I've got to clean my room and get all my history books together. But definitely, yeah, I love it.
It'd be great. But he did one where it was like a Soviet tourist describing America, and they were acting much the same way. They were like, oh, why don't people just go to the committee and ask the central government to change this and this and this, and wait for the committee to decide on the meaning of the thing. And then it also had me thinking about things like marijuana legalization and like Snowden and all like the civil liberties stuff. All these things that people have been clamoring for decades now. And you would have thought that like the government committees and stuff would be like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll do that, but it just gets put on hold until people forget about it, and then it's got to start all over again in the next election cycle. So I thought that was a kind of a clever. I know a lot of utopian books are as much about the time they were written, like satire of the time they were written, as they are about the future. So like the euthanasia and abortion stuff. It might also be a reference to like Clinton era, politicking. So I don't know. I thought that was fun.
I remember. I have memories of like the pro-choice Republicans, where the line was always, "Well, I'm conservative on economic issues, but I'm a liberal on social issues." And I can't figure out whether they got BTFO'd in the Trump era or not. Like the neocon, like Bushies, definitely got BTFO'd by Trump. It's they're all embarrassed, off trying to do some dinky think tank now, and it's like the Republican Party transformed into the anti-war party somehow. How'd that happen?
How that happened?
Well, I guess that's true. I mean,
happened so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, because the neocons are definitely still around. I mean, we got Biden as president right now. Oh shit! Sorry, did that just get you deplatformed mentioning the election? Oh crap!
Yeah,
and you don't give credit to Kamala Harris.
I think you're allowed to say. I think you're allowed to say Biden. You're just not allowed to say certain things about the 2020 election or certain things about COVID.
Which was completely fair, and there were no problems, and there's never been a problem in an election, not even during the Bush years.
Yes, everything's fine. We have to say that the 2020 election was totally above board. The completely fair, completely not corrupt in any way 2020 election. There is no
expression that you have to sit on the voting box if you want to win.
Yeah. But no, I mean, because he's a diehard old school neocon. I mean, he's like a neoliberal, but he was the guy that wrote the Patriot Act, for fuck's sake. So, but yeah, I mean, I guess as far as the Republican Party, maybe they got BTFO'd. I don't really know. I hate American politics.
Well, and that's right. And then we Americans always talk about American because for us, we're like 50 different countries. So following American politics is like trying to follow 50 different countries. So we don't give a damn about anybody who's across the pond. And then for all you guys, you got to pay attention.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was another theme I was thinking of when I was going through The Giver. Because most of the time when you have these utopian books, it's always something about a world state, right? Getting back to like the Russell New World Order. I mean, sometimes it's like the three world states, Russia, China, and America, Europe, NATO, right, in 1984. Or it's like the one world state in Brave New World. But it sounded like we don't get much information about the outside world in The Giver, but the implication is that it isn't a world state, and that there are many places in the elsewhere, possibly, like these other communities with other rules and their own ways of doing things. And I was thinking about the old like autonomous zones, right? You guys remember Chaz? from the before and before and before.
I remember,
like 6 months ago.
I remember.
You remember the tell from like the 6 months ago. Back when people were trying to assert independence and trying to have their own kind of forms of governance. And then
now, slightly rephrased it. Like you could tell that the gears were turning, and you thought, we probably shouldn't call it an autonomous zone. We should call it a protest to just keep treason off the books, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, now you mentioned autonomous zones, and you get a thing about like why secession is wrong, like a sidebar in Google being like, secession is wrong. The Civil War is great. Blah 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 blah. But there are times when you do get these sort of breakdowns in central authority and more regional authorities popping up. And I thought it was kind of interesting how in The Giver, the world that they envisioned wasn't, like the people living inside their community were very strictly controlled and tightly controlled. But there was this implication that wasn't universal, that there were places where other ideas could be had, other people could do other things. It's possible that every one of these communities is in the exact same boat, or what I was actually thinking was maybe this is some kind of like Fallout Vault-Tec situation where everybody's been stuck in their own kind of planned community and they're running experiments to try and figure out like what's going to happen in each of these societies as these rules get imposed on them. But I don't know, that could just be me. But yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting, and I think it also related to the family unit, which was another thing I picked up on, which is very common in utopian writing and philosophy and books and novels and stuff. Like how you deal with the family unit, because the family unit is in many ways, like the ultimate autonomous zone, right? You have your family, and your family has its way of doing things, and it's very, very difficult to control a society from the top if values and ideas and lives are being shared by these very tiny nuclear autonomous zones called families.
It's harder than controlling an individual. You can shape an individual, but you have this inevitable problem.
Shaping an individual. Yeah. Yeah, it's not that hard, because it is hard, but if you can get that individual into your schools and you can reach that individual directly, then you can shape what that individual will think and how they will act. But if you have this mediating level of the family, right, it becomes that much harder to get through to everybody and to get them all on board with the program. And a lot of times, like families are just done away with completely. Right, like Brave New World, like nobody has moms, dads. They're literally like test tube babies. So I thought it was interesting that they took this again. It might be a reference to the Clinton era, like the it takes a village situation, where like yes, you have the families, but they're not nuclear families. They're vetted and they're licensed by the government. And you have to go for like 3 years, and they have to decide that you'll be on board with the program. And even then, like, it's not perfect because people still disobey certain rules and they're still kind of cheeky, right? Yeah, so I thought that was
a little controlled opposition. You're allowed to. You're not technically allowed to teach your little sister how to ride a bike, but we'll look past it.
But we'll allow that. That's okay. Yeah.
You can't drink until you're 21, but if you have a little sip of beer when you're 19, okay, whatever. You give them a little bit of leeway on certain rules, just to ensure that they don't break bigger rules, I guess. So I thought that was kind of interesting too, especially compared to like these other places like 1984, where like you get caught on your telescreen teaching your sister to ride the bike. You're gonna
everybody's dead, your sister's dead, you're dead.
Yeah. Your sister no longer exists, and you're sitting in the pub 5 years later talking about how funny the Daily Show.
Big Brother is wonderful. Yeah.
Whatever it is. Yeah. It's.
So here's a question. So Punchy Sonichu, if you had a bunch of Punchy Sonis running around, would you let them read The Giver? And at what age would you let them read The Giver?
I mean, assuming that I let them read, so I'm teaching them to read, right?
Right. You're not performing some weird experiment where you try to like raise them without language or anything.
Because I think that would be the way to have them read The Giver, is just to experience The Giver and to feel The Giver, right? Don't have them mediated with language, just have them express The Giver. I mean, I guess like if they wanted to read The Giver, like, I mean, there's a lot of other books that I definitely want them to read first. Like the Road to Serfdom, for example. Like I'm probably going to get them on that quite early. But yeah, I mean, I didn't find anything particularly objectionable about it. There are, again, things that are very wrong in current year terms, like the cisgender stuff, which I'm sure she didn't anticipate how problematic it would be to say there are two genders. Back in 1993. But I don't give a shit about any of that.
The girls get special garments and the boys get this.
Yeah. So I mean, if they want to read it, I mean, the way I was brought up was very kind of hands off and lax, almost negligent, I guess. And I don't want to say I want to be negligent with my kids, but if they want to read it, I wouldn't put like an age limit. They'd just be like, hey, yeah, if you can read it and understand it, go for it. I'm not okay. Go for it. So right, Geek. What about you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I read it in 1993 when it came out, and at the time that would make me about 14. So, here in my local area, some of the schools actually assign it to 8th graders, and I think that's about the right time, I think, for them to really understand sort of the depths of the story. I think if you go any earlier than that, they might be able to read it, but they wouldn't really understand all of the layers of what's going on. But an 8th grader and above, I would say, yeah.
You kind of need puberty to hit before you get anything where puberty is a central plot point. Like little girls understand, oh, when I grow up, I'll be married to a wonderful man. But you don't get it until you don't get it until you experience it, right?
Right.
Yeah, well, I guess, but is that? I mean, that was definitely an element of the book, but I think that they could still get a lot out of The Giver without that puberty stuff. Like that was sort of the B plot, or even the C plot, was him wanting to bang this other girl or whatever. And I mean,
in a very subtle way.
I think it's important to, in a very subtle and tasteful way. Certainly more subtle and tasteful than I would have been in middle school, or anybody that I knew was in middle school. But I mean, I do think that it's important for the structure of the story, since this is like his feelings for what's her face, the girl, are very important for his development. Fiona,
awakening.
That's kind of his first step in rebelling and getting away from society.
Though he was, was he told not to take them, or was he permitted not to take them because of his giver training?
No, he was told to take them originally, and then he was told
he chose not to take them.
He was told that he could. He was told that he could not take medication, or he could take medication that he was prescribed, but he couldn't take medication that related to his training. And he was like, well, this doesn't relate to my training, so I can still take the meds. So he still takes the meds. But then later, when he starts developing feelings and he starts understanding feelings and he starts understanding like families and girls and what he's missing, then he makes the decision to lie, to take his like rebellious clause so that he can stop taking the meds. So originally he takes the meds, even though he's the receiver And then he decides, okay, you know what? I'm going to free myself. I'm Prometheus unbound, and you know, I will now be a simp or whatever, you know. So yeah, that. So I think in that sense, you know, it would be important for kids to understand puberty, because then they'd really understand why it is the kid's really willing to risk everything for that. But overall, I think it was kind of a minor point, and I think if I was too young to understand the birds and the bees, it would not negatively affect, or it would not negatively affect my understanding of the book or the overall message of the book. So
I guess when
that would just be where
I didn't read this one when I was a kid, but I read like 1984 when I was like 13 or something. Because someone just like put it on a list of like great books. My parents put it on a list of like great books to read, and so I read 1984, and there are all these steamy sex scenes, and I've never read anything with a sex scene. So I just thought, oh, okay, well, I know what sex is. I've just never seen it described before. That's all. How about that?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot more explicit in 1984. So.
Well, the reason why I kind of put the cutoff at 8th grade is not so much because of the puberty aspects, but just because of the sophistication of the message that we're trying to get across, which is that there needs to be. I think that the message is there needs to be a balance between the rationally ordered society and the chaos of nature. There is also something that I haven't brought up yet, but is very much on my mind, is the idea that wisdom comes from adversity and comes from suffering and pain. There is very much that idea that because no one in the community has memories of suffering and pain, and they have never experienced pain of their own, they are unable to have wisdom, and that's why they needed the receiver to be the chief elder to inform all the other elders of what was the wise thing to do. Because without that pain, without that experience of pain, they would not know the right answers.
They couldn't expunge it from the human soul entirely. They couldn't expunge the need for it, even if they could expunge it from everybody else.
Right.
Yeah, they needed someone to keep the morphic field in check. But would you then say, right, Geek? I'm not sure I'm following it. Is it are you saying like kids have to be old enough to understand like pain and loss, I guess, to really get the book, or are you concerned that they might come away with it with the wrong message or something?
Basically, I think you have to be old enough to. It goes to like my experience as an educator, like able to get out of a text that is between the lines of the text. I think you have to get to a certain level cognitively, the ability to see abstraction in order to abstract that meaning from the text.
Okay. Well, would it be because one thing that I would be thinking here is like Lord of the Rings or C.S. Lewis. Let's say C.S. Lewis, because you're
right.
both Christians, right? You're both familiar with C.S. Lewis?
Yes.
Correct. Yeah.
I take it.
Yes.
I know Marmaduke is. I know we've heard him mentioned. Because I read C.S. Lewis when I was like 5 or 6, right? I went through like all of his books, and at the time, I mean, they were really good books. And I think I got a lot out of it. I completely missed the Christian aspect, right? I remember when I first found out he was a Christian, I was like, I think 13 years old, at a boarding school, and there was like a counselor or something there who was like, hey, you know, you like C.S. Lewis, huh?
Did you know?
Here's a book by him, and he it was one of his Christian books.
It's
like,
really interesting how Narnia did manage to like make that hop over into the broader culture, because you can then see like whole parallels, chunks of his ideas in Narnia.
Yeah, well, when
paralleled in
when
his
you're old
Christian
enough,
writings.
when when you're aware of it, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But you know, if you're like 5 or 6, you completely miss that. I guess my question would be, you know, is that a bad thing though? I mean, should I have not read it, or like I think C.S. Lewis is a lot better than The Giver.
I'm not saying that.
No offense to The Giver.
Yeah,
but
not,
you know, I think in a similar way, like people could read The Giver without understanding every nuance of it and still come away from it
Gotcha.
with messages that are positive. I guess would be my
Reiki. Do you have a thought on that one?
I think you're right about that. I'm just saying that the 13 or 14-year-old, I mean, you can read it younger, but I think that you really have to be at that 13 or 14-year-old, or at least cognitively be there in order to extract at least like 51% of what's in the book. Like,
I have a couple thoughts. So what's interesting about that is I've been trying to think a lot about like what did I take away from things when I was a kid, and so I guess what I'd say to Punchy is, yeah, I'd actually be just totally fine with a kid reading a book that's beyond their grade level, because maybe that's part of the whole point, is it pushes them to think beyond their current grade level. Like that's one of the signs of a precocious child, is they're a voracious reader. And like if the child's bored in school, or if a child has like really good maybe like intellectual gifts, like they're going to be reading, and they're going to be, you know, like trying not to be bored and encountering lots of books. So I guess like I'm not a father, so I don't have like a really pressing need to worry about this. I guess so if I'm going to be an uncle and like giving books to my nephews and nieces. So I guess one thing I think about is, would this give the kid nightmares? Because if it gives the kid nightmares, then their parents are going to be yelling at me for giving their kids nightmares, right? So beyond like that practical dimension, I'd basically be like fine letting a kid reading anything that they think they're ready to read. Like maybe you give them the caveat, like, well, there's some scary dinosaurs in this. You think you're ready for a book with scary dinosaurs in it? Yeah, I'm ready for a book with scary dinosaurs. Okay, you can read this book. Go for it.
I mean, like that's kind of a good point.
Yeah, but when I pick a grade level, like, I'm not saying that's like a hard and fast line. I'm just saying, on average, that's when they would be ready for the kind of abstract ideas that are in the book. But obviously, there are going to be many precocious children who will be able to get something out of it younger. You have to know, like, you have to know the particular child to make that judgment, basically.
I feel like this is going to be important for an educator, because then you're also trying to cater to lots of different children who might have different interests, right? Like the classic example is you make everyone in the high school class read Romeo and Juliet. You know, 2 kids are deeply moved by it. 50% of them are snickering about it, and 50% of them are just like zoning out.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I mean, I'm kind of coming at it from like, well, if it were me, blah 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 blah. But I'm not necessarily representative of all people, and I definitely wasn't representative of all kids. Like the area that I grew up in tended to have a lot of precocious kids, because we were in like an academic area and all our parents were teachers and stuff. But I think in general, maybe kids wouldn't get as much out of it as some other people would. All the same, you know, I'd still at least offer it. Like, if you want to come and check out The Giver and you're like 6 years old, go for it, knock yourself out. Maybe you'll get something out of it, maybe you won't. You know, at least give them the chance. I don't want to be like controlling, like coming up and being like, okay, now you're the 12, now you get your assignment. Oh, look at this, you're the Giver reader, blah 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 blah, right? You know, so
I was thinking about how I was raised out in. Go ahead, Reiki.
It's just a rough. Yeah, I was just saying, just for rough guidelines for average's sake. But obviously, like I keep saying, obviously every kid is an individual. I grew up precocious as well, and I read a lot of books before I was really supposed to. So, a precocious kid could get something out of it. I'm just based on my experience as an educator, that what I've noticed is that most kids, on average, will not be able to really get the full experience or a strong enough experience from the giver until they reach that ability to abstract.
I have a parallel point. So something I've noticed is there are books that I would read because they have good stories, and there are books that I would read, I don't know, because they make me feel smarter. And I feel like if you give, it's the contrast between like for a kid who wants to be entertained, a book or the television or video games, or comic books are all competing forms of entertainment. And then for a kid who wants to expand their mind, then it's like then they have to like gravitate more towards books because of some of the complexity. And so maybe if you have like a book where I call them book porn or book prime, where the whole point of the book is to sell you on the importance of reading books. Maybe like for a regular kid, that'll maybe like they won't. I feel like they won't connect with that because they'll get that part of what the book is trying to do is it's trying to tell them that reading books is good. Like Scout Finch. Scout Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. A big point of Scout Finch's character is that he's this voracious reader who is maybe like an intellectual kid trapped in a little bit of a backwoods town, right? So if you make all the kids read that and they don't want to read that, they might like not resonate with that. Whereas if you are a voracious reader and you encounter Scout Finch just through reading naturally and picking your own books, you'll probably connect with her a lot more if you first come to the conclusion that reading books is good, and then the bookish books start to speak to you a little bit more.
That is 100% what actually happened to me. Yeah, that's what happened to me when I first read To Kill a Mockingbird. Is I immediately identified with Scout, and I think it's because, as you say, I had already decided that reading was fundamental. So
yeah, I guess that's a good point. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking now is like, you know, especially in the context of reading lists, like if you're going to make a kid read a book and they wind up hating it, you know, they might either not get anything out of it at all or get the wrong thing, right? Like they'll start resenting it and hating it. I'm actually checking the internet right now for details on like the bans and challenges and stuff. And I can't really find too many specifics about The Giver. It's mostly just like ad copy, which, as I expected, having worked in the publishing. But I'm actually finding interesting stuff on like the lists of banned books. And actually, one of the number 2 most banned series. Can you guess what it is?
Is it Judy Blume?
The most? No.
No.
Right, you have a guess? No, it is Captain Underpants.
Ah, all right.
The series Captain Underpants.
Because of potty humor.
I mean, it's not. I mean, it's a fine book. Like it's fun for kids, but it's not, you know, some big intellectual book where, you know, it's going to challenge you and make you, you know, the next Einstein or something, right? So, and I suppose like kids are really enjoying reading Captain Underpants because it's a fun book about, you know, a kid in underpants who runs around and does
the teacher. They snap their fingers and the teacher takes off his pants and runs around in his underpants. So there's an anti-authority vibe to it too.
So it's this is the kind of thing that that kids are looking for, right? Oh god, 50 Shades of Grey is on there. How is that? This must just be like general books too, because I don't think they're reading 50 Shades of Grey in schools. Hunger Games and stuff. Yeah, like Hunger Games. I mean, there's a few that are like classics, like The Adventures of Huck Finn, because it's got the racist language, naughty language. But most of these Scary Stories is actually the most frequently challenged book of the 90s. You guys know Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark?
Didn't know that. I heard that title. Like some of these are titles I heard as like, oh, you better not read that book. Like I was very much like the stereotypical suburban household, right? Like, oh no, Dungeons and Dragons is of the devil. We can't have that.
You may be too young for. Did you ever see those?
That's interesting. That I think that my upbringing kind of falls in the middle of you guys' upbringing, because on the one hand, I was precocious and my parents allowed me to be precocious. They allowed me to read whatever I decided to read. So I recall learning about sex and reproduction when I was like 8, just because I read it. And they didn't restrict me in any way when it came to that. But then at the same time, it was a military family and we were very conservative in lots of other ways. So I'm kind of falling in the middle a little bit, where I wasn't like, oh no, don't do Dungeons and Dragons, that's of the devil. No, that was not a part of my upbringing, but in many other ways there was conservative aspects to it. So as for scary stories, that does ring a bell. I don't remember anything specific about it though.
Yeah, you might have. You were probably at least in the age range. It was big in the 90s. I think it came out in the late 80s. But it's, I mean, the reason I liked it was because of the art. The guy who did the artwork is just absolutely brilliant, and I love him. Mm-hmm. And I've actually tried to do stuff like him. In the past, I actually, when I got to college, I asked some of my studio art professors how I could go about doing it, and nobody seemed to know. So if you ever want some really good scary art, look up the artist from Scary Stories.
So is it scarier than Goosebumps? Because I remember Goosebumps being a phenomenon.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely. It came out. I think it came out a bit earlier than Goosebumps, but it was kind of the underground, like hipster version of Goosebumps. Like it was the thing that you read if you were
too
really
cool for Goosebumps,
right? Like, yeah, you were too cool for Goosebumps. Goosebumps was for like the babies, and Scary Stories was for the cool rock kids. But it's not. I mean, it's not a hugely enlightening book series, right? It's not the kind of book that's going to be, toppling regimes or anything. And it
is interesting to see what's popular, because if you read what's popular, even if it doesn't speak to you, maybe it tells you like what are the people getting out of this. Bring it back to politics. One of the things that kind of changed me was I was like a never Trumper, and then when he won, I thought, okay, what is it that people like about this guy? And once you kind of like ask that question, it's sort of like you get a whole different perspective on his entire personality. But he's funny, and once you realize, he's funny, everything about the man changes, right? Like you stop being like, it's the end of the republic. This guy Donald Trump. It could be the same thing for literature. Like if people like it, maybe it says something.
Factor. It's the Chris Chan factor. Like at first, people might come at Chris Chan and take it really seriously and get really frustrated and mad because he's a crap artist and he's doing all this weird stuff and it's absolutely reprehensible and you get really mad. But then as soon as you just let go and realize how much fun it is, how funny it is and how enjoyable it is and what a positive affirmation of life it can be, then it just everything you're freed, right?
You can be like a true and honest fan then. Yeah,
you become the true and honest fan. You see him as...
Sorry, I wonder if Scary Stories... Sorry, I'm interrupting, but I wonder if Scary Stories was the anthology book I read that it included a story in which the shadows in somebody's bedroom come to life and basically swallow him. I remember a story like that and being kind of creeped out by it. I wonder if it was in one of those books. Yeah.
Did it have really frightening illustrations? Look up Stephen Gammell, I think is the guy's name. Gammell. He has a very distinct style.
Yeah. And I was looking it up just now, so
absolutely horrific art. Like that's actually the thing. Like the stories were kind of grim and scary, and yeah, they usually end with the children getting brutally murdered. But like just with the artwork itself was nightmare inducing, and that was really popular when I was like 5 or 6 or something, right? You know, it was the thing that we all read in like grade school. But we weren't like reading The Giver or anything. We were reading like fun books, you know. Not necessarily the most edifying books, but fun books.
Yeah, I'm looking it up right now.
Actually,
to see.
Well, kind of one thing though. You know, there are some books that kind of bridge the gap, though. I think, like Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah.
Because Calvin and Hobbes is probably my favorite book from like my childhood, and I often find myself coming back to it, like in adult life. Like many of the attitudes and ideas that I have now were cultivated.
It's literally about an intellectual child who's trapped in a boring school. Right, so he acts out because he's bored, because he's ahead of all of these other kids, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun, but it is very, very deep and meaningful at the same time. And you remember a lot of little set pieces, right, that maybe you don't really understand at the time, but you come to understand it when you're revisiting it in your memories, you know, years later, right? There was I remember there was like a couch gag or something, like a couple throw off panels of Calvin reading like some book or something, and he's asking Hobbes. Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses. What do you think he means by that? And the next panel is like, you know, 8-year-old kids obviously know all about Marx and religion being the opiate of the masses. And then the next panel is a television set that's thinking to itself, it meant that Marx hadn't seen anything yet. And like, it was funny at the time. I was like, oh, that's kind of silly, you know, the thing. But then that actually got me like kind of looking up who Marx is and kind of thinking about it. And, you know, the older I got, you know, especially like in college, I was like, yeah, actually, that's completely right. Right? You know, just little things like that. Like I read it when I'm 8 years old, and it's fun, but then it's also edifying. And much later in life, I can come to appreciate, you know, the nuances of the joke. Right? There was another strip that I really liked. I actually wound up doing a project on it in art school. Was high art versus low art. I don't know if Marmaduke.
Oh yeah. That's like every art student's favorite roundtable discussion. So just so you know, I feel like that's another one of those low wit, mid wit galaxy brain things where like the low wits and the galaxy brains like low art and don't care, and the mid wits are like obsessed with making that distinction. But go ahead with your point. Sorry if you're a mid wit and I just insulted you.
No, I'm fine with it because. Actually, I quite like Calvin and Hobbes' perspective on it. Have you read that particular strip that I'm thinking of?
I've read the entirety of Calvin and Hobbes, but I need a reminder.
Okay. Maybe you should actually. It's a very short one. Just look up high art, low art, Calvin and Hobbes.
Okay, I'm gonna mute and then search it.
It's the paintings and the comic strips. The difference between a painting and a comic strip. Which I really enjoyed, you know, things like that.
I found it. Okay. Calvin says, a painting, moving, spiritually enriching, sublime, high art. The comic strip, vapid, juvenile, commercial, hack work, low art. A painting of a comic strip panel, sophisticated irony, philosophically challenging, high art. Hobbes, suppose I draw a cartoon of a painting of a comic strip. Calvin, sophomoric, intellectually sterile, low art.
So my idea in school was to do a painting of a comic about a painting of a comic strip. So I suppose that was kind of sophomoric too, but I thought it was fun. And I loved the way that he kind of skewered this high art versus low art debate. I'm definitely more in camp nitwit than I am camp high art. Like I appreciate high art. I was actually praised by one of my teachers for being very open to like modern art and expressionism and like spots on a canvas kind of stuff. But I think at heart I'm very kind of low art nitwitty.
So, something I'll just say in praise of Bill Watterson is I've seen a million boomer comic strips about how modern art is lame, and it's always just like it's the same joke over and over again. But Bill Watterson actually makes fun of himself, where it's Calvin being in a comic strip, so there's that meta aspect of it, and he's making fun of how sophomoric it is to make fun of the high art, low art discussion in a comic strip, which is exactly what it's doing. So it's like layer upon layer upon layer of galaxy brain in Calvin.
It's very Poe. And I mean, he took art very seriously. Like, did you ever read the Cubism one? Was another one that I read.
Where he's literally entering into a cubist world. Yeah, and it's just one of
where he sees every side of every argument. He sees everyone's perspective because his dad had asked him to look at both sides of the issue, and now he's looking at both sides of the issue, and it looks like a cubist painting, and he can't go anywhere. So he's like, no, it doesn't work.
And there's it's interesting how Watterson did variants or themes. So there's another one where Calvin only sees in black and white, right? So the setup and the punchline are the same. Calvin's dad tells him something. Calvin tries to literally see the world in that perspective, and it's like a really weird experimental comic art thing. And he comes back and tells his dad, like, "Shut up, Dad."
No shading or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of he plays around with these art concepts. He does it visually and philosophically, and it's a lot of fun. So something like that. Getting back to The Giver, I don't think The Giver's on that level. I don't think it's one of those things that you could read at 8 years old and then 20 something years later you're like reminiscing about, like, oh yeah, you remember that great point where he didn't take his boner pills or something. But I think it's fine, for what it is. I think it was okay.
Okay, so does anyone have any final thoughts that they would like to share before we close for the night?
Surprisingly, a surprisingly good children's book. It shoots above the grade level it was written for. I think it's a worthy contribution to, like, if you want to make a collection of good dystopian novels, I think it earns a place, and adds just a few. Like, we went off in all kinds of different directions on what it signifies, right? So I think some of the contrast between emotion and reason, or logic and order, and chaos and history and feeling, really evokes a lot of different ideas that took us in all sorts of different directions. So I think that's a testament to there's a really good idea packed into The Giver in a nice condensed form, but it could really prompt a lot of thought.
One thing, this is getting kind of way back into the before, but it's kind of nagging at me now. Marmaduke, earlier you had said that you were very much into like romantic arts and paintings, and you were describing one. Were you referring to Caspar Friedrich's The Wanderer?
Let me look at that one again.
I think it's called The Wanderer. And I think it's by Friedrich. I have
Wander Above the Sea. That's it. Yep. That's my favorite. That's my favorite painting to illustrate what romanticism is. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that one's brilliant. That's one of my favorite romantic paintings too. But the reason I'm kind of coming back to it is, again, my whole takeaway is that this whole book is about, on the one hand, sameness, but also about this conflict between the rational and the romantic. And actually, Friedrich was very well known for his snowscapes and like winter landscapes, and he did like various ruins in the snow, as well as these really badass Arctic landscapes. Have you ever seen those?
I haven't seen a lot of his other work, actually. I'm trying to look up some of it.
Looking him up. You probably have. You might not know who he is, or you might not know who did it, but how do you spell his name?
Okay, Caspar, like Casper the Friendly Ghost. No, it's spelled differently. Caspar.
Spar, David, Friedrich. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, you can probably just look up like his snowscapes and things, because that kind of brings us back to the ideas of like the final section of the book, right? As he's going into nature, as he's getting further and further into nature, he's getting into more and more snow, winter, right? Like winter is this representation of nature in its rawest, most deadly, but beautiful form, right? Let me see. Oh God, what was the Arctic? Yeah, that's it. Arctic Shipwreck was the one I was thinking about specifically, with the giant hill of ice. Like be a good representation of the final.
I actually want to look into it more, because that painting has always spoken to me, but I was never really familiar with his broader work. Shipwreck in the Arctic by Caspar. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's because he's a romantic, I guess, and they don't get many fans these days.
So I've actually like defended postmodern art in the past, but maybe one of the things that has annoyed me about it is we've become so interested in the modern postmodern dialogue. It's like, there were a lot of interesting guys, before we and our grandparents showed up. Maybe we need a break from 21st century diatribe and just go look at some old Roman busts or whatever.
Yeah, that'd be great. And oh God, what was it? The Sublime too, right? Getting back to that idea of like romanticism and the precision of language, because I remember from art history classes, right? Like, are you guys aware of the technical definition of the Sublime?
Okay, closest. I've got to think back to some of my assigned readings. So, I know that. Great. What's the name? One of the famous English philosophers wrote on Sublime. I'm just totally blanking on his name. Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is famous for being like the first conservative philosopher, but most of his research was actually into the experience of the sublime. So I guess for Christian thinkers, it would have been a connection of the sublime to the experience of God, but maybe outside of a Christian context, they'd be connecting the sublime, I guess, more to a state of appreciating the world separate from its utility. Maybe would be my working definition for it. Like, I'm assuming you've got Punchy. I'm assuming you're connecting this to some really fascinating 19th century philosopher who could make the point. So
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I could definitely see how that understanding of sublime could connect with the understanding of sublime that I'm about to drop. But basically, the idea, I forget exactly how it was worded, but it's a combination of that which is beautiful, but at the same time terrifying.
Okay.
Right. The sublime is like the winter storm, right? That's absolutely lovely to look at, but it will kill the hell out of you if you get caught in it.
Horror is very connectedly closer to our appreciation of beauty. Yeah. The fear of the forest and the beauty of the forest all in one.
It sounds like what you're talking about is It sounds like what you're talking about is what we talk about in psychology, the moral dimension that people operate on that goes higher to lower, like the base and the animal up to the divine, that vertical dimension of thinking in human moral reasoning. Yeah. So anything that's sublime is anything that's playing with that dimension.
With the two halves, or with God too, right?
Yeah.
Because God is both immensely beautiful and incredibly terrifying.
Isaiah meets God and he says, "I am undone. I have unclean lips." He cannot speak or function in the presence of the glory of God. Yeah.
Because that is the sublime. That is the experience of the sublime. And with the Romantics in particular, this was something that they were very much concerned about. That's why you get like these Friedrich paintings where, you know, there's the gentleman standing by the sea, and it's a very beautiful painting, right? But if you actually stop to think about it, you know, there's like this little tiny guy next to this massive cliff with all this open sky and crazy clouds, and everything's just kind of crushing in on him. So it's terrifying at the same time. And this is something that you get right out of The Giver, especially as he goes on, right? You know, as he gets out of the Midgard, right? You know, this idea, the enclosed society in which he lives, and as you get further and further out into nature, it becomes more and more sublime. It becomes more and more beautiful, more and more pleasurable, but also more and more painful and more terrifying, until eventually, you know, again, you're dying in the snow, only you're not dying in the snow because she goes on to write sequels and ruins the whole book. But
and I would say that well, at least what I take away from that is that the sublime is inseparable from the suffering. And if you try to separate from the rest of the experience of life, then life suddenly gets denuded of all meaning.
Let me come at this from another angle. Yeah. So if you go before the Romantics, like my understanding of the sublime in, say, like Renaissance era painting, is people usually talk about the sublime in painting in connection to things that are sort of like so human, it speaks to you without understanding the context. Like, so for a lot of painting, I've got to understand the theology, I've got to understand the patron and kind of like what he was desiring to communicate. And then for maybe like a painting like A Boy and His Grandfather, it has this sublime aspect where if you don't know anything about the people or the time period, it still communicates to you after all of this time. Here we go. An old man and his grandson, and the painter is Domenico Ghirlandaio. And it's kind of ahead of its time because he's not doing like any kind of like symbolic stuff with it, with like a lot of people will put like the patron saint you're named after in the painting. Look at you. And for an old man and his grandson, it's just a grandfather with a horrible disfigured nose and his sweet little grandson. It's very human. Man, right? Yeah. You got it. His nose is just like completely covered in warts, like maybe a disfigurement. Yeah. Yeah, you literally have beauty and ugliness all in one, but the ugly isn't ugly. You see the ugly as beautiful because of the love of the child for the grandfather. Yeah.
Right.
Is it completely without imagery and other tropes though? Because I mean, I'm looking in the background, right, and you have the water and the blue, which represents purity. The winding road,
right. Life, he's still a product of his time. He's still a product of his time. Yeah. But it's sort of like maybe he's shooting ahead a little bit, but
it's less. Okay. Yeah, it's less. Like,
this is just one of my old art teacher's ideas. Like my old art teacher had this idea that artists towards the end of their life start anticipating what the next generation are going to be doing. So you see Michelangelo at the very end of his life, when he's an old man, he starts sculpting like himself as Joseph of Arimathea holding Christ. And it's sort of like he's starting to disfigure his figures a little bit, like Michelangelo, the master of, burlesque figures. He's starting to draw himself as an emaciated old man. And so my teacher's point was that this is anticipating the direction modern art is going to be going, where they start expressing more emotion in their figures, where they just start distorting the figures a little bit more. So, and maybe this only applies to like the great artists, like the artists who change art history, because then because they're doing something a little different from everybody else, people want to imitate that and bring some of that into their own art, or maybe nobody discovers what they're doing for a while, and it's only like 50 years later when someone looks at them again and says, whoa, wait a second, that guy was doing something different than everybody else around in his community.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I would say to that. I mean, I'd be kind of skeptical if my teacher was saying that, because again, you can say like, oh, it's anticipating. There's the sorry, this is my postmodernism showing again, but there's that old South Park episode. I'm referencing everything. The one with the smug, where like San Francisco gets destroyed by a smug cloud. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that.
I'm not I've seen a little South Park, but I haven't seen it all.
Right, well,
just real like Cliff Notes version. There's a scene where Hollywood actors are giving a speech, and the big Hollywood actor guy gets up and starts talking about how forward-thinking Hollywood is and how they're ahead of the curve on everything and how they anticipate everything. And apparently this was clipped off an actual speech that was given. And the thing is, like, I'm thinking, like, it's not so much anticipating as it is creating, right? Like this whole like politics is downstream from culture kind of thing, right? Like if Michelangelo,
which comes first, does art imitate life, or does art? I got you.
Yeah, does life imitate art? Like if somebody as important as Michelangelo is doing something, or if big Hollywood actor is doing something, it's not so much that he's anticipating these things. It's just that he's done it, and now everybody, kind of wants to cliff off it. Plus, like with Michelangelo, especially. If you're saying like, oh, he was anticipating modern art, I mean, there's such a gap between that. It could just be a case of remembering the hits and forgetting the misses, right? Like you guys have heard of that concept before, right? It comes up a lot in like with psychic investigations.
Right. Like you could.
Right?
I was sort of exaggerating the point for hyperbole, right? Like the romantic hyperbole is that the genius. The genius creates the new world, and maybe like the more moderate point of it is the genius has an idea that's kind of a cool idea, and who knows when we're going to pick up on that again, or how that idea is going to percolate, right? There's like a romantic way you can articulate it, and maybe a bit more of a down to earth way you could articulate it. I think I get you.
Yeah, and I mean there's things like one of the things that I'm thinking a lot of is Salvador Dali. Right now, you guys,
right? He
I mean, obviously, like everyone's familiar with Dali's
canvas beside his bed, yeah,
and he does all this like weird, trippy, like, oh man, the clocks are melting and the ants are running around. But you've seen his later work, right? As Christians, maybe.
His crucifixes, right? He would do like crucifixes at a very like odd angles.
Started doing a lot of like Christian work, and it became less trippy, more realistic. I mean, it still wasn't realistic. It was still very surreal, but it was very sort of religious and iconographic. And I mean that never really went anywhere. We haven't seen a resurgence in faith-based modern art or anything. So I don't know. I mean, I get where you're coming from, but like I'd always be kind of skeptical about trying to apply, like, especially for an individual artist. Sometimes they get it right, some of them don't. And even if they don't, like who really cares really at the end of the day? Like is the culture of your time the correct culture, right? Like the Giver guy is obviously trapped in a crap culture, and he has to go off and create his own. So the artists and the thinkers who created that culture for him, just because they created that culture and people followed them and came up with the rules, like, does that mean that the rules are right?
Right.
So was Michelangelo right for me? So I don't know.
So maybe I want to take it out of art. The Right Geek and I, we talked about the play Heroes of the Fourth Turning, which is about like four Catholic intellectual students debating like their concerns about the culture war. And one of the themes in that book is like one of the characters keeps quoting the fourth turning, right? So it's kind of like it influenced Steve Bannon. It's this idea that every generation participates in like this cycle through history, and everybody fits into these archetypes. And it's a really fascinating idea. But then you kind of have to step back and think, do I really just fit into an archetype just because of when I was born, right? So maybe like the caution is, like, it's really fun to think about, cycles in history. And so maybe to bring it back to art history, then it would be like cycles of movements. Like the Renaissance gives rise to the anti-Renaissance, gives rise to academic realism, gives rise to Impressionism, gives rise to modernism, right? Which is true. It's like it's true, but if you dig in, no one ever fully fits into that 100%. Like there's this idea that maybe there was no such thing as the Renaissance at all. Like maybe what we call the Renaissance was really the way of those people describing themselves, because they viewed themselves as, we are going to reclaim classical culture. We're going to be better than the awful Gothic Dark Ages. And so for some Italian humanists, their way of thinking about that was describing it as the Renaissance. But was that going to be the way that every, run-of-the-mill artist, banging out paintings for his patrons was going to think about it?
I actually don't know this, but maybe you do. Were the Italians actually describing their time as the Renaissance at the time, or was that something that was applied to them retroactively?
I feel like it wasn't going to be like your average Joe. I don't think like the average Joe was walking around saying this is the Renaissance, but I think there were some humanists.
I think it might have been. It might have been retroactive, actually, but okay. I could be remembering incorrectly. Yeah.
Because my understanding,
I think it was retroactive.
There was a fascination. There was a fascination, and let's get back to the classical culture, right? Like they discovered the Laocoon, and it's sort of like the Laocoon created this cultural cringe. We're like, wow, why can't we sculpt as good as these guys could sculpt? Yeah. We have to study these ancient Greek sculptures on purpose to try to figure out what the ancient Greeks knew, right? So it's true in the sense that it describes a real thing people were doing, but I don't know if it's true in the sense that it's not true in the sense that everybody was walking around saying we live in the Renaissance. Yeah.
Well, that's actually.
And the other thing is, if I could step in, the other thing is that it wasn't like it wasn't like a sudden thing either, because if you actually look back at the history, what's usually recognized retroactively as the High Middle Ages was a very intellectually and artistically fecund period before the Renaissance, right? So it wasn't so much like there's this boundary and boom, we're in the Renaissance. It was like gradually developing into the Renaissance and then gradually falling off.
Like a midwit can develop just enough of an understanding of history to believe a complex but false idea about it, and then try to stuff history into that package.
Yeah.
My favorite one is the Dark Ages were terrible and everyone was stupid, but in Islam it was a golden age and everything was wonderful, and it was they discovered math and discovered Aristotle. Kind of true, actually. Like Thomas Aquinas got interested in Aristotle because he recognized that a lot of the Islamic scholars were reading Aristotle. So basically, like, you never want to dumb down history to just like this one idea about this period.
Yeah. And I mean, just getting to like the contemporary period too. I mean, obviously, nobody's going to know until much later, what label we're going to apply to like current year period or whatever. I just call it current year because whatever, it's me, and I think it gets to the heart of what's going on. But for my part, right, like I've always kind of been like postmodern, I guess, if that makes any sense.
Ray Geeks actually shared some artists with me who are interested in the kind of a postmodern direction for like doing it consciously.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say like new sincerity kind of things, like bringing back sincerity and meaning to art, and kind of bringing wholesomeness back to art, but in kind of an ironic way, if that makes any sense. But the thing is, right, like in recent years, especially, right, like post 2016, I've seen this process has kind of accelerated, right, with like a swing back to very kind of traditional forms of art, traditional forms of expression. But it's getting to the point where it's. I know some people have brought up like the religious right in the 90s and how much worse people are now, and like SJW Twitter is now. And I actually have a theory, which I know I've mentioned on Twitter, which people got very mad about. But I actually don't think it's a new thing. I think that the people who would have been in the religious right are now the people who are on, SJW Twitter. And I don't think, like there's this progressive idea that you can change people, you can change their nature, the world's going to change fundamentally, right? And I don't really think that's the case. I think as you change people, the words that we use to express the ways that we communicate and interact with the world might change, but there's still going to be people with that personality type, that kind of authoritarian, tell you what to do. It's just now they call themselves SJWs rather than the religious right, because they weren't brought up with religion or anything. They were brought up with, wokeism and Marxism and these other kind of things. So I don't think it's so much that the religious right disappeared. I think it just got rebranded. And now, like I'm sitting here and in many ways, like I'm kind of like, oh yeah, this is nice. It's getting kind of more wholesome. But I'm also feeling myself like getting left behind and being worried that, maybe I'm going to get liquidated or something for being too libertarian and being too liberal and stuff. So it's
you just got to reread The Road to Serfdom over and over again. Not actually, that wouldn't be very comforting, would it? It would reinforce the fear.
No, it wouldn't. It just reinforces things. But the thing is, right? Like even when you're living through the period, right? You don't neatly fit into any category. Even the people who most keenly embody these categories, I think, don't neatly fit into the category. Because like I've known people who have been described to me as horrible SJWs, right? And if you get to know them as people, they really aren't like horrible, or at least they're not the kind of horrible SJWs that you have in your head when you're told about the archetypical SJW. So yeah, I mean, I don't think. I suppose I'm kind of taking it for granted that the past was like the present, and the present will be like the future, right? Like this whole Humean thing. But I think that kind of dynamic was going on back in like the Renaissance and classical periods and things too, where nobody is there's no okay, I am the Renaissance guy and I do everything Renaissance-y, right? There were people in different walks of life and different continuums, and I'm sure there was some weird hipster wearing like 13th century clothes or something running around Venice, just being wacky, so yeah, I definitely agree with Marmaduke in that, and I think it's still going on now, and I think it will continue going on, at least until we embrace sameness and
Scott Adams has
the end of history.
Scott Adams has a nice saying that we have categories we use to make things simpler to talk about. Just don't assume that the category is always true or is literally correct. Yeah. And my favorite is left versus right, because it's a category we use to simplify political conversations. It doesn't it generally works, but it doesn't always work, right? Like if you assume left versus right is universally true, you're going to get confused. Or like the hot take memes on Twitter, you're not going to get those jokes because they rely on sort of upsetting those traditional paradigms. By the way, I've really appreciated this. I have got to head, so thank you guys so much. And
I'll
let you have fun.
Yeah,
I gotta go.
Probably sign off as well. So yeah, yeah. So let us conclude for the night with just our concluding thoughts.
All right. Well, Warzone just made the quote. Did you want to read it or?
Yeah. So Warzone says progressive did help get American cartoons canceled. The RR could only get so much traction.
So that would kind of be like we're not parallel. I don't know. The two, like people connect them all the time, but maybe they don't fit.
Yeah, well, I think it's just because the progressive.
I wonder
left is
what.
Kind of the... the thing that they want to, that the NWO wants to have win. So as soon as the RR goes and does things, it's like, no, you can't do that. But once you rebrand as the Progressive Left, I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, come on, let's get the American cartoons canceled because you're on the right team. But I don't know. I'm very, very cynical about, especially like left-right politics, and I don't want to get it deplatformed. So some other day we could get into that. Yes.
Yep. So, yeah. So anyway, so The Giver is it's a good book. If you guys haven't read it, do so. It raises some interesting ideas, as we've discussed tonight. And I hope that we will have an audience again. I think our next one is going to be Brave New World. So get ready for that one.
We definitely want Punchy for that one, for his Galaxy Brain take, don't we?
Yeah, yes, we do. We do want to hear Punchy's Galaxy Brain take on Brave New World. I'm also going to have another Iron Man stream coming up because Iron Man's coming out next week. So, but thank you, Warzord, for being our listener tonight. And if you are listening to this later, I also thank you for listening to this later. And I hope you all have a good evening. And we're signing out.
Catch you later.
Remember.